Today is the last week of Advent, and it's the Sunday where we talk about the characteristic of peace. And peace is a big part of the Christmas story, where you hear about peace on earth and Jesus bringing peace to the world. And peace is something that has definitely seemed to be missing in our culture recently. I was spending time with a few of my friends last week, and we were reflecting on the year 2020. And it was interesting because as we were reflecting on it and talking about the difficulties of this year, it wasn't so much that we were talking about the financial difficulties or about the restrictions that we had to follow, the lockdowns, spending time by ourselves. None of that was what we were dwelling on and highlighting as the difficulty of this year. But what we were talking about was just how stressful the year was. And that was really the worst part of it, was just not knowing what was going to happen and feeling on the edge of our seat the entire time and nervous and anxious. And that really was the most difficult part for many of us in dealing with this year. And this is why peace is so important, because peace can allow us to go through stressful situations without feeling overwhelmed by them, without having that edge of the seat feeling of instability and not knowing what's going to happen next. When we have God's peace in our life, it allows us to face unknown circumstances without worrying about what's going to happen. So let's continue. We've been going through the Christmas story found in Luke, and we're going to continue where we left off and look at the peace that the people in this story had and talk about how we can have that same kind of peace in our life. So we're going to continue reading in Luke chapter 2, starting with verse 15. This is right after the angels appeared to the shepherd. It says, "When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, 'Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing which has happened, which the Lord has told us about.' So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in the manger. When they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. On the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise the child, he was named Jesus, the name the angel had given him before he was conceived." So let's look at some of the things that happen in this part of the Christmas story that show us the peace that these people had. First, as soon as the angels appeared to the shepherds and gave them the good news that the Messiah had been born, and then the angels leave, it says that the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." And in verse 16 it says they hurried off. And I really like that picture in my mind of the shepherds hurrying off into town to see Jesus. And that's kind of important that they were hurrying off, because when I picture it in that way, that doesn't sound like they led the whole flock of sheep with them. It sounds like they ran off into town without the sheep. And that's really important if that's what happened, because the sheep was the whole livelihood of those shepherds. That was everything they had to, well, probably not everything they had to their name, but the most important thing they had to their name. If they lost their sheep, they would no longer have a way to make a living. They would lose their whole business. But they chose to follow the instructions that God had given to them of going and seeing the child, that they were willing to leave their sheep to hurry off to see that. And that had to take a lot of faith and trust in God to know that God would take care of their sheep while they were gone, that no wolves would come along and eat them, no thieves would come and steal the sheep and put them into their flock. They had to trust that when God told them to go and see this child, that as they hurried off to go see it, that God would take care of the rest of it. God would take care of their sheep. God would take care of their livelihood. God would help direct them to where they had to go. They had to place an awful lot of trust in the instructions that they received from God. And that allowed them to have peace in their life, to have peace about these sheep that they were leaving behind. And that applies to our lives as well. We can have peace in our lives when we trust in God's instructions. When we listen to what God has for us, we read His Word and see what God wants us to do with our lives. And we say, okay, this may not always make sense to me, but I'm going to trust what God is telling me and let Him take care of the rest of the details. Because God always has, God sees the whole picture, and so He's not going to lead us down a destructive path. He's going to lead us down the most meaningful path. He did that when He told the Jewish people, gave them the custom of washing their hands before they ate. That didn't make any sense to them. They didn't know why they had to do that. But now that we know about germs, we understand why that was important. And so we have to have that trust in God's instructions. And that trust will lead us to a place of peace where we say, okay, God, I may not fully understand this. I do have other things I'm worried about, but I know that this is what you've told me to do. So I'm going to follow through what you've told me to do. And the instructions that God gives us will lead us down the right path. And sometimes that's all we have to worry about, is doing what God tells us to do. Did you ever have those toys that was a little wooden box where you had to fit the right shape into the right shaped hole? So you had to put the star into the star hole and the square into the square hole. And if you tried to put the star in the square hole, it wouldn't fit. Because there was only one right way for things to go. God has one will overall. And when we act in accordance with His will, it will work out. And when we become too stressed about all the other things in our life, that we say, well, God, I'm not sure about following what you've told me because I'm worried about this. It's like sitting with that box and trying to fit that star piece into the square hole and being so worried. God, how is this piece going to get in here? God, I can't get this piece in here. And God's saying, put the star piece down, just put the square piece in. And we say, well, God, if I do that, then the star doesn't get in, and I need the star to be in there. And God's saying, well, right now we're working with the square hole. That's not going to work. And God only gives us the instructions we need for right now. And when the time comes to put the star piece in, He'll show us the right way to do that. But God's not going to lay it all out in front of us because we don't need all of that, and that would be too overwhelming. God only gives us what we need now, and we just have to trust that He knows what's best, that He knows better than we do. At my other job, where I work with adults with disabilities, we have we have new staff coming in all the times, and one of the most frustrating things is when they don't follow the directions that we give them. So for everyone that they work with, there's a little piece of paper they have that has all of the important information they need to know about working with this person. And as long as they just follow that instruction page, they'll be fine. But we have so many people sometimes get into trouble simply because they didn't follow the instructions on that page. Maybe they thought they knew better and think, well, I don't think I have to do this with this person. I think it'll be okay if I just do this a way that's more comfortable for me, and then they end up getting in trouble. And it's like, why couldn't you just trust us who have worked with this person more? We know them better, we've known them longer, and if you just follow the instructions we gave you, we wouldn't be in this difficult circumstance that we're in now. How many times has God done that with us? Where we've said to God, God, I think I know better. I think I've got this figured out. And we don't listen to what he's trying to tell us, and then we end up in a worse situation where if we simply listened to what God was telling us to do, he would take care of the rest, and he would see us through to where he wanted to lead us. So we need to have trust in God's instructions, and we also need to not worry about the things beyond God's instructions, because we have to trust that God will take care of that as well, just as how the shepherds were willing to leave their flock to go and do what God had asked them to do. So then the shepherds went, and they found Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus. And when they saw him, they went out and began to spread the word about what they had seen. So they went around telling everybody that they had seen the Messiah who had been born. And that was a big deal when you understand that Jesus was not born the way that people thought the Messiah was going to be born. The people thought the Messiah would be a mighty king, royalty, powerful, a league all of his own. They were not expecting a little boy in a manger. And so when the shepherds saw Jesus, the fact that they were willing and chose to go out and share with people on the streets what they had seen and heard shows that they must have had peace about it, because otherwise they would have been worried about their reputation. Oh, nobody's going to believe this. Who's going to believe that the Messiah is laying in a manger, in a stable, to people of no particular consequence? Who's going to believe that? They weren't worried about what people would think. They weren't worried that people would think they were crazy for suggesting that that baby was the Messiah. They weren't worried about what people would think of them. All they were concerned with was spreading the truth of what they had seen and heard. And this is another key to having peace in our life. When we value the truth of God over our reputation and pleasing people and being concerned about what people think of us, if we can get over that and just focus on God's truth, it will bring a new peace into our life, because then we aren't worrying about what other people think of us. We aren't worried about our social standing. And when we're not worrying, we're at peace. So when we stop worrying about our reputation and instead just focus on sharing the good news, on sharing what God has given to us, what we've witnessed in our own life, what we know to be true, instead of worrying about our reputation, when we focus on the truth, peace begins to fill our life. Our reputation can oftentimes get in the way of what needs to be done. It makes us worry to the point of paralyzing us with fear at times. To give a kind of silly but practical example of this, I remember when I was at a restaurant with my family, and it was one of those buffets, so most of the family was up getting their own food, but me and my two sisters were still at the table. And my youngest sister was reaching for something, and she accidentally knocked over her drink, and it spilled out across the table. And she immediately began to panic, and she was worried and began to get emotional and teary-eyed, and oh no, oh I'm so sorry, and she was paralyzed by what people were going to think of her because of what she did. But my other sister and I, when we saw the drink spill, I'll always remember this, we immediately just very calmly began to grab napkins, and we set the drink up and began wiping up the drink and wiping up the table, and did it very calmly. And there was such a big difference between those two reactions, between the person who was concerned about how they would be viewed because of the mistake that they made, and the other people, me and my sister, who simply saw the problem and went to fix it. We knew it had to be taken care of. The longer we waited, the worse it was going to get. So we immediately jumped into action. And we were able to do that because we weren't concerned about ourselves. We were only concerned with the problem. And if we can find a way to do that in our life with every situation we come across, where we're not concerned about our reputation, we're not concerned about what people think of us, we're only concerned with doing what God has given us to do, then we can be filled with peace, knowing that we're walking in the will of God and not concerned with other people, not concerned with ourselves. And the thing is, you cannot walk in the will of God and be liked by everyone. In fact, in John chapter 15, Jesus talks about this. If we look at John chapter 15, beginning at verse 18, he's talking to his disciples, and he says, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also." So in that we see that Jesus, who did everything perfectly, who was without sin, didn't make any mistakes, people still hated him. So how can we expect to walk in the will of God and also be liked by everyone? It's impossible. Scripture shows us that. It cannot be done. So we first have to come to terms that the world will not like us, that there will be people out there who disagree with us, who challenge us, who persecute us, who hate us, because we stand for the truth of God. And if we're not able and willing to start with that in mind, then we will not be able to walk in the will of God and have peace, because we will always be constantly concerned with what other people think of us. And constantly thinking about that will only bring worry and stress and anxiety into our life. So if we want to avoid that and have the peace of God, we have to learn how to take the focus off of ourselves, how to take ourselves out of the middle, realize that everything doesn't revolve around us and what people think of us. Stop focusing on ourselves and instead focus on the truth of God. That's another key to having a life filled with God's peace. We also see in Luke chapter 2 the very famous and powerful verse, verse 19. "But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart." Now, what things is it referencing there? It's referencing all of the promises that she has been given that has come to pass. Some of the promises that we talked about the first week of Advent, when we were talking about hope, how the angel appeared to Mary and promised to her exactly this, that she would have a virgin birth, and that she would give birth to a son, which happened. The virgin birth happened, gave birth to a son, that happened, and that he would be the Messiah. And now these shepherds came after those fulfilled promises. The shepherds arrived, saying that angels had appeared to them, announcing the birth of the Savior of the world. Another promise that had been fulfilled. That's what Mary is treasuring and pondering in her heart. Those fulfilled promises from God. This is another thing that we can do to have peace in our life, is to simply recognize the work that God has done. Recognize the promises of God that have been fulfilled. When we do that, when we realize how God has been faithful to us, it can give us so much confidence to continue to trust in Him in the future, to know that He's going to work everything out for the good of those who serve Him. And when we understand that and recognize that, that is another thing that gives us peace. And one of the wonderful things about the work of God is that when God does a work, it's not just something that He does and then it happens and then it's done and you move on. But the work that God does is always continuing. God is always doing a work in us. And this is something where it's hard to translate it in English, but in the original Greek language, this will be a little lesson for all of you out there. In Greek, there's a form of verb, so different verb forms like, oh, I do this, I did this, I had done this. Those are different verb forms. Well, there's a verb form in Greek that is called the perfect tense. And what the perfect tense of a verb is that it's describing something that was done in the past that still affects the present. So something that was done in the past and the effects of it can still be felt today. Which is so powerful theologically because so many of the works of God are like that. When God does a work in our life, we remember it, and even though it was something that happened in the past, it still has a tremendous effect on the way we live our life now. And that's how our life should be. That's how our relationship with God should be. It shouldn't just be like, oh, God did this thing in my past and it was cool, but that was a long time ago. But when we take time to reflect on it and recognize the work that God has done, not only does that make a difference in who we used to be, but it can continue to change us and do a work in us in our life today. When God fulfills a promise, not only is it incredible at the time because the promise was fulfilled, but it's also a testament to the faithfulness of God that we can hold on to every day of our life from then on. That's the way that God works. That's the kind of ministry that God does. And so it's so important that we make the most of that by recognizing all of the things that God has done for us, all of the work that He has done in our lives. And when we take faith in that, when we trust in that, it can give us the solid foundation we need to stand on in our world today, no matter what is going on, no matter how difficult it is, because God has brought us through difficult circumstances before, and we know He can continue to do so. When I was younger, I used to always I used to question everything, and that was just kind of the person I was. I was the kid that was always asking why questions. Well, why does things happen that way? Well, why is that? That was just kind of the person I am. I'm very critical. I tend to look for things and wonder, well, how can this be improved? And is this the best way to be doing this? By nature, that's just how I am. And one of the things that I critiqued when I was younger was pastors in particularly, but really anyone, but mostly pastors, who would hang up, um, just have their college diploma and high school diploma hanging up in their office. And for me, I would look at that and I would wonder, well, why would you do that? That seems kind of prideful. Like, it seems like, oh, look at this diploma I have here behind me. That's so you know that I'm an accomplished person and I've done a great thing, and so I'm deserving of respect because of what I've been able to do. So you should show me respect because of how great I am and the things that I've done. And that's kind of how I viewed it. But over the years, and as I've grown up, I've realized that that's not necessarily the case, and it's certainly not the case in my life, especially when it comes to the little certificate I have of being a licensed minister, of being a credentialed pastor. Because I remember when I was 8 years old that God called me to be a pastor. That was what God placed in my life. And so when I think of how far I've come since I was 8 years old, and I'm now in a place where I am a pastor of a church, and I am credentialed, I am a licensed minister, and I can hold that certificate in my hand. When I look at that, I'm not thinking, oh, how great I am for accomplishing this. Instead, I think, how great is God? That what he called me to, he has strengthened me to reach that point. That what he has promised me, he has fulfilled. And so I do now have that hanging up in my office, and I like to look at it not because it reminds me of all the great things that I did, but it reminds me of the faithfulness of God and his fulfilled promise in my life. And I recognize it as that. And it gives me hope and strength to continue to trust in God as I do my ministry. And I think we all need to have things like that in our life. Things that remind ourselves regularly of God's faithfulness. Because God is so faithful to us. And he simply asks that we show that same kind of faithfulness to him. Just as Mary, as she was witnessing all of these things happening, all these fulfilled promises, all of these things that God told her would happen, actually happening, she treasured those up in her heart, recognizing that they were fulfilled promises of God, that they were a testament of God's faithfulness. And we need to do the same thing in our lives, is remember and recognize the ways that God has been faithful to us. So in this passage, we see ways to have peace, ways that God wants to fill us with peace no matter what our situation looks like. It's possible for us to have peace. We can have peace when we trust in God's instructions and his truth while remembering his fulfilled promises. If we can do that, if we trust in God's instructions, if we stop worrying about us and our reputation and focus on God's truth, and in doing so, in that process, remember and recognize all the ways that God has been faithful to us and the promises that he has fulfilled, we will have peace in our life. So I pray that you will be accepting of this message and that God's peace will fill your life, and that it would be so powerful that the people around you would be able to see how peaceful you are. And you would have those questions, how can you be so peaceful with this and this and this going on? And you can say, it's not my doing. It's simply because I trust in the instructions that God has given me and his truth. And I know I can do that because this is some of the many ways that God has fulfilled promises and been faithful to me in the past. And that's why I can be this way today. And that can open up conversations to lead people into a relationship with God. So that's why I pray for that in your life. And as always, if you have any questions or comments about this message, you can always email me at sermoninthepocket@gmail.com or get in contact with me on the Sermon in the Pocket Facebook page. And I would love to hear from any and all of you. And if you like this program and want to support it, the best way to do that is to pledge a support on Patreon, and that can go towards covering the cost of this program or helping me to upgrade some of my equipment. And as always, I encourage you to share this with family and friends to help get the message out there. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I pray that God will continue to bless you as you go throughout your day.